Welcome back to the live stream. This week, Steve Keen and Mike Radzicki are going to teach us economics using system dynamics. Hell, Dan might even try to keep this fun. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of Steve and Friends. I'm your host, Daniel Sanderson, and we're another week in, and today it's just the three of us. We're actually going to be looking at system dynamics, doing some models for you. Not so much me, because I've been that lazy philosopher that completely stays out of Minsky. I've tried a couple times and keep saying to myself, I want to go back. I wonder how many people are just like that. How difficult it is? Well, I think we're going to hopefully break down some of those myths. In today's episode, I'd like to start off with a little bit of, I don't really want to say meditation, but I want you guys to start thinking about how you derive truth. And I just mean from a day-to-day standpoint. I mean, I'd like to get, as I bring Mike and I bring on Steve into the show, I'm going to actually prompt them to say, where is it that you actually get your information from? I mean, I can assume and I can make an assumption that it's not from Fox News. Fair enough. Okay, so where is it? Where do you go? I know I subscribe to a journal called PNAS, the PNAS Journal. They give, very useful information about discoveries in science, of which I remember Steve even says published there, I think once or a couple times. But where does the average person go? How do they make their way through this onslaught of information overload? That's what I'd like to know, and let's bring on Steve and get his opinion. Steve, why don't you come onto the show?
I hate to say it, but I'm the sort of obsessive bastard who, when he wants to know what Aristotle said, reads Aristotle. So I go back and read the originals, and that's always been my approach. I think it was lucky in some ways that I was exposed to how bad textbooks were in my very first year at university, and I completely stopped trusting them at that stage. And so if somebody said Samuelson said something, I went and wrote what Samuelson actually said. And that's one of the privileges of being an academic, because I can just go and download virtually anything online these days to do that. But it makes it extremely hard for people who are, like you said, the ordinary person, meaning a person with ordinary levels of access to information. And I'm a bit of a loss. I think the main thing is to avoid being caught up in cults. And the trouble is, there are cults everywhere, from people who believe the Earth is flat to people who believe neoclassical economics, which is flat Earth economics. So there's so many ways you can get caught into a trap of groupthink, and it really is hard to say how you avoid that.
There's a thing I don't know, it's hard to show with the camera, but the finger pointing and the three back at us. So I'd say that the show kind of leans a little bit left. So we introduced two cults, or two ideas of cults that are primarily on a conservative side of things. Can you give a couple of examples of how a leftist tradition has moved into a cult? Like, is it
Marxism, conventional Marxism? Because of my very first breaking away, the first contribution to pointing out how something was wrong was actually Marx's theory of value. And I led a student revolt at Sydney University out of the teaching of economics. I was not the only leader. There were three, which I think is actually one reason why it works so well. And masses and masses of people involved in it, at least 50 active students campaigning to reform economics. And that was matched across the whole of the University of Sydney in 1973 after a strike that began in the philosophy department. Dan, you'll be pleased to know. I think I've mentioned this before, but it was a strike over the staff, two new staff wanting to teach a course on philosophical aspects of feminist thought, being blocked by the professor, supported by the rest of the department, and then ultimately the entire university. Pretty much 40% of the student body was on strike. So it was all about questioning what you were being taught and so on. And then at the end of the year, as leftists do, they decided to have a Marxism reading group. And I went into that group, and my point of skepticism was that I could not accept that all the machinery I could see around me was adding no value. So I went into reading, and basically, again, the same story, read in great detail. So we read the first 7 chapters of Capital. I think it was in chapter 5 or 6 that the logic that Marx used, which was a philosophical logic based on Hegel's dialectic, which is not the dialectic everybody else think Marx used, which is this idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It was foreground, background, and tension, the short summary of the concepts that Hegel used that Marx employed much more effectively. And I found that Marx actually derived, using that dialectic, derived a theory of value which contradicted the Labour theory of value. So I raised that in my discussion group with my 20 or 30 or so lefty friends in the main quadrangle of Sydney University in a brilliant summer's day, inside sandstone walls where you couldn't even see the sun. And they laughed. They simply laughed. Keynes got it wrong. Obviously, Labor theory of value is right. Well, fucking bullshit. Pardon me. The logic contradicted it. So I saw it, and I've now seen it. It's happened a couple of times on Twitter this week as well. Somebody actually came out and said, knowing my own logic, said that the use value of machinery is not different to its exchange value. I said, well, you better tell Carl that then. And I quoted in page 283 of the Grundrisse, where Marx said it has to also be considered that the use value. Look, they can see stuff and Marx is a great intellect, no two ways about it. But he found he created a better form of analysis which contradicted his old one, ran away from it because it meant the whole idea of revolution was removed from his concepts, couldn't bring himself to do that, fell back into trying to convince himself that it was consistent, and 150 years of Marxists after that have continued falling for Marx's bullshit rather than for his logic. So that's a classic case. So I saw it on the left, I saw it on the right, and that makes me the ultimate skeptic, I suppose.
Yeah, homeless, right? I mean, this is the burden of the thought leader, right? It's lonely out there. And I just, as a plug to you, Steve, I think that's how I have grown to appreciate your work, is that there are contributions, right? I mean, there's a lot of academics out there, but there's several contributions that, mounting a valid argument against somebody like Karl Marx is monumental. It should be celebrated in society. Like, what, you really, yeah, wow, that's amazing. And then an immediate ripple effect, right? But it just,
so I get rubbish from both sides. People who think you shouldn't read Marx, and people think I've read Marx wrongly because I don't come up with a conventional interpretation.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's bring the American in and see what he has to say about Karl Marx. Mike, how does Marx
of Marx? So yeah,
filter in your classrooms?
Well, I'm reminded as an economics student back in the 1970s, a lot of the econ students had a poster hanging in their dorm room that said, "All hail Marx and Lenin." And it had John Lennon and Groucho Marx in the poster.
Yes.
So the spelling is a little different, but
having a sense of humor definitely helps, mate. Definitely helps.
Yeah, well, so Marx, it was really Joseph Schumpeter, I think, who was the first really famous economist who took Marx seriously as an economist and said, this guy was the first sort of evolutionary economist, and let's give him credit for that. And you can say maybe there are some problems with the theory, but by and large, he was an original thinker, right?
Absolutely.
And and attempted to explain using, well, I was always taught the anti-Hegelian. You had to read the German ideology first, and then the Communist Manifesto, and then 3 volumes of Marx, as I recall. So he came at it, from the philosopher's point of view, I suppose, and applied it to what he's observing, and so we give him credit for that. And again, does his model have some flaws and so forth? Yeah. but we give him credit for what credit is due. I always point out to my students too that often the Marxist economists who taught me and were Marxist students would always say, if you want to see what Marx was seeing when he wrote what he wrote, don't read economic stuff. Go to literature like Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol and so forth, Ebenezer Scrooge. That's what the guy was seeing when he was writing this stuff, right? It's not what we have today or whatever.
I also say that if you want to imagine what London was like at the time, imagine Calcutta 40 years ago. The tannings. What's that? That's the Suitable Boy, I think, is the novel about a woman looking for a husband for her daughter, The Suitable Boy. I think that's the novel. I've forgotten the author, unfortunately, but it just gives a vivid description of what it was like walking through Calcutta and Delhi when you've got tanning sites everywhere and untouchables working with the leather and the smell everywhere, and of course, until about that time ago, regular cholera outbreaks. The reason Jenny and Karl Marx moved out of Chelsea was because of a cholera outbreak. So if you really have to get that physical sense at the time that when he wrote, is to the passion with which he attacked capitalism. And then of course when he realised he logically undermined his own case against it, you can sort of see the desperate attempt to hang on to the position he'd built for himself as a alternative thinker, which was totally around the idea that the revolution was inevitable. And imagine if you say, terribly sorry, guys, I've just proven it's not inevitable. Wouldn't have gone down very well in the Third International.
And even history would not look kindly upon that type of thing. Well, let me get to that point in a second. I want to thank everybody for joining in. I look up at the thing, we're 1,400 plus viewers. So let's get the comments. Let's get I think that's an aggregate of Twitter and LinkedIn and YouTube. So, thanks for the support. Thanks for the growing and continuous support on the channel, everybody. We really appreciate it. Let's get the comments in, and what was I going to say? I think I was going to ask you guys something about Pareto, just to kind of move the conversation into this modeling mindset. Do you guys, as post-Keynesian economists, do you look much at Pareto efficiency?
No, I think it's bullshit. Pardon me. I think the whole idea that you can reach an optimum. Optimum is anti-evolutionary, and this is probably the most important point that I've clarified for myself in writing my most recent book, which I'm serializing on my Patreon and Substack over the next couple of months, by the way. But yeah, when you look at what actually happens in markets, you don't get equilibrium. You get evolutionary change. And the whole idea of equilibrium is an anti-evolutionary concept. So Pareto was a good engineer and a lousy economist.
Interesting.
Yeah, a lot of neoclassical economics, including the whole concept of Pareto optimality, is, in my opinion, sort of like the physicists, what they say when they say, imagine a frictionless surface. And they say, okay, if you had that, all these things, and then you say, now real world, you don't have that. And it's kind of like, okay, in this,
what was the point of that?
Mythical, self-contained world, yes, all these things happen. But then you say, does that offer any guidance for the real world? And a lot of times if not often, or most of the time, I should say, it does not.
No, damaging. That's one reason we developed system dynamics, in fact, to get away from having to think in terms of equilibrium.
Yeah. Imagine,
go ahead,
imagine
Mike.
if you will, if Karl Marx was a system dynamicist and had that modern tool set and knew how to use it.
Well, in fact, when you look at
expressed his ideas mathematically and precisely and found inconsistencies that way and so forth.
Well, in fact, that's when I first got involved in modeling Minsky, it was using Goodwin's model, and we might get into the system dynamic stuff now. But I think, Mike, you should take the lead on this. But let's finish up the conversation here. In chapter 25, I think section 1 or section 3 of volume 1 of Capital, out of the blue, there's a section where Marx discusses rising and falling wages. And so you have falling and rising profits, and therefore what you get is basically a predator-prey effect. That was in 1867. Now, it wasn't until about 1917 that Volterra and Locke actually worked out the predator-prey model. And we know that Marx spent a lot of his dotage trying to learn mathematics I think he took too much of a philosophy approach to it. He didn't actually try to, this is how it works. Let's see how I can apply it. But there's reasonable evidence that he was trying to build a dynamic version of this model that he did verbally in chapter 25, which became Goodwin's growth cycle model. And I'm going to build that while I do my piece today. If he'd done that, he would have been 40 to 50 years ahead of the mathematicians.
Yeah. It's really interesting. So, Mike, I think we're going to kind of move towards a Mike Radzicki demonstration. Is that something you're ready for? If we were to jump into that after the top chat.
Yeah, but I have something special I've cooked up for you guys today as a surprise.
Yeah.
Can I do that now? Is that okay?
Well, get into it.
And I can share my screen?
Top chatters first, though. Top chatters first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So we're going to do top chatters.
Do I do
first?
the top chatters this time?
Yeah, and then we're going to do your demonstration.
Oh, okay. Yep. Very good. All right. So what do I see today? David Fields, Bill Goggin, Patrick Lovell, Economics in One Lesson, Alphaism, Utilitar, Petrified Produce, Tony Wilson, Jovianar, TR, Larry Summers is with us again, Ghost on the Half Shell, hi Ghost, Siculori, Economici, Genric, Lukanzinchuk, Nicholas, I slaughtered that one, Nicholas Gomez, Peter Kaam, Bob Liori, Randall McMurphy, Murphy, Dre Guy, Rick O'Brien, D. Smith, Political Economy 101, Teddy Bruschke, Connor Howell, Nicholas Gomez, Josh Buckham, Stavros Karagorius, Danger Zone, Heron, Quirin Peggy, Big Hammer, Jim Roberts, Neil Bison, Nobby Clark, Syndicat, From Where I'm Standing, Kathleen Smith, Algorithm, Urajo, and HPB.
Wait for it.
Got a couple stutter steps there, but
wait for it. I guess our crowd disappeared.
No sound effect. Our system is down today.
I like the big hammer. The big hammer one, Mike. I'm wondering if that was like the beginning of a cult, because we had last week's hammer episode.
Oh,
we got
I
big
forgot.
hammer
Yeah,
showing
the
up,
hammer
right?
thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Taylor Swift, my good friend Taylor. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Get back to class. Okay. Everybody's sitting down. You got the lecture hall full. You've got 2,300 people in your lecture hall, Mike. No pressure.
Yeah. So before I do that, though, I'm going to do my special treat for you guys.
Okay.
So here at WPI, we have a new president. And new presidents come in and they have grand ideas and we're going to do whatever, blah, blah, blah. So her grand idea is everybody needs to be figuring out how to use AI in whatever they're doing. Of course, we're a polytechnic, so we better get our act together in the AI space. And people were doing AI stuff anyway. But so we're all charged with that task. So I started playing around with AI. So let me show you what I came up with. For the show, and I have to hang on, just bear with me 1 second here, if you will. Sorry. I got several screens happening here, and I want to make sure I don't mess up big time. Okay, so I'm going to I can share my screen, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And let's see.
The middle one down the bottom, Matt.
Yeah.
Minimize the screen, and then you'll see there's 5 buttons down the bottom below our faces.
No, I see that. It's asking me, entire screen.
Yeah. Don't worry, Mike. We're on a live show. Just take your time.
No, well, so sorry. How are we doing now? Can you see my white background?
I will turn it on here. Yeah, just hold on.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
So
yep, got that.
All right. Okay. So AI can do lots of things. One thing I was playing around with and asking it to do was to blend images. Okay, so let me show you what I came up with. So here's me blended with John Maynard Keynes. This is what AI says I would look like if I was blended with John Maynard Keynes. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's me and Karl Marx.
Nice.
Me and Schumpeter.
Okay.
Me and Jay Forrester.
Huh?
Wow.
Me, there's some noise or some special effects. John Sturman and myself.
Uh-huh.
He's the Jay Forrester professor. He took over for Jay at the System Dynamics community.
Looks happy.
Steve and Adam Smith.
Oh, nice.
God. They all look like the Sparrow from Game of Thrones, but anyway.
Yeah. Jonathan Price, yeah. Ewan Keynes, Stephen Keynes.
Okay. I don't think I like the
Stephen
blends at
Hyman
all.
Minsky.
Oh, yeah, okay.
If I blended Ty Keynes and John Maynard Keynes, and if I blended Socrates with
That's great.
and if I blended Dan and Ty together.
Oh my.
And if I blended all four of us together, this is what we apparently look like according to AI.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Very good.
RRR. So
That was the
patron
patron,
stop sharing.
the patron saint of
I think we need some votes on which of those are the least attractive and which of those are the most attractive. There's some pretty weird combos there, I've got to say.
That was the original algorithm for Facebook, right? You know, yes, no, yes, no.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to see where the screen is now. Am I still sharing or not sharing?
Nope.
No, you're not sharing anymore. You've turned it off. Yeah.
Okay. So
you ready with Stella?
hang on one second. I don't know where you guys went. Hang on.
Oh, shit.
Oh, wait. Oh, okay. Gotcha back. Okay. All right. Some Stella stuff. Sure. Let me, I'll share and just bear with me 1 second here. And
they're waiting. They're at 1751. So the closed the door. Yeah, someone closed the door. Oh, 200 more people came in.
Okay. All right. So everybody should see a blank piece of electronic Stella paper, if that's clear.
We got that. Yep.
Okay, good. All right, so how would we build just a very simple little Stella model? And at the moment, I'm not going to get into how would I know what to put in here. This is just mechanically how we would do it. But what we do is we build models with stocks and flows and feedback loops and limiting factors, okay? So stocks and flows create dynamics. So if you're going to look at the change in any system over time, at least from a system dynamics point of view, we believe that occurs when stocks, and here's one on my screen, think of that as a bathtub. When that bathtub fills up and or drains, that's what causes dynamics. So mathematically, the filling and draining or the process of accumulation or decumulation is called integration in calculus. So nature integrates, it doesn't take derivatives. Okay. So how do the stocks fill and drain? Well, they use flows. So this is a flow, and you can tell it's a flow because it says flow, but it's supposed to represent a pipe and faucet assembly. So that can fill, in this case, fill the tub and here the stock, and then you could have a drain. You can have any number of stocks and flows that you want in a system dynamics model. Of course, you're trying to simplify things, so you don't want like 75 ins and 75 outs or anything, but you could in principle. So we have a very simple stock flow structure here, and you have to tell the software how many of whatever it is items are in the bathtub. So I just said there's 10 people, 10 buildings, $10, 10 units of morale, a soft variable. It doesn't matter. You can pick whatever you want. And this is actually, let's say we're going to grow here by 2 units every period. And we now have the simplest dynamic system in the world, really. One stock and one flow. and we can say, what does this look like over time? And we can run the model. So we started at time 0 with 10. We added 2 every period for 100 months, I guess. And we have 210 when we're finished. And that makes complete sense. Start with 10, add 2 every month for 100 months, and you got 100. Okay. Now, if we were to say that this stock is something like people and call this births, okay, so now you see we've changed over here. We have some kind of population and it's growing linearly. And let me do something here. We'll say initial people, and I'm going to say that this is no longer 10. I'm going to say it's initial people. So we're starting with how many, however many's in here. So I'm going to define it outside the stock for just a minute here, show you why. And let's go with 10 again, 10 people. And we're every month there's 2 more babies that come into the world, according to our logic. Okay, just sort of fiddle with things a little bit. If you start with more people here, you can see the plot changing, right? Because you're starting with more people in the stock. Okay, makes complete sense. Well, where this thing goes awry, if we tune it down, we go down here to 0, what happens? We keep having babies born, even though we're starting with no people. I mean, you need at least 2 as far as when I took biology, right? So this model has a logical flaw. So one of the things we look for when we do system dynamics modeling is we test the heck out of little pieces of structure. Would be just one mechanical example of doing that. So we want to make sure that it doesn't do something silly before we hook it up to a bigger piece of structure. So this model fails right here. So what's it missing? It's missing feedback. Remember I said stocks and flows and feedback loops. So feedback is the transmission and return of information on what? On the amount of stuff that's in each of these tubs, these stocks. The stocks define the state of the system at any given time. Okay. So now you see we got a little warning sign up here again because the software is saying, look, you connected this telephone wire here, and I made a loop, I made a circle, but the software, Stella, need to know how you want me to combine people with something, and you haven't told me that yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in a fertility coefficient here. I got to spell it right. F-E-R-T-I-L-I-T-Y coefficient. And, we can make it something like 0.02. And now we're going to get rid of the constant and say it's people times the fertility coefficient. Now, this could also be money in the bank, in your bank account, and this would be the interest rate that the money is earning. Of course, same idea, if you started with no money in your bank account, you're not going to earn any interest. Right. So again, if we run this thing with, I spoiled it. I should have done this. So if you run it again, we're starting with 10. Now you see in red for a reinforcing or a positive feedback loop, a self-reinforcing process. Okay. Now we get exponential growth rather than linear growth. And I spoiled it because I didn't reset everything. But if you go down to 0, I went negative here, but if you go to 0, you find out that, mechanically, you go to 0, then it does the correct thing. We're not starting with any people. We're not starting with any money. You don't get any growth. Okay, so real systems grow exponentially. They don't grow linearly, even though on certain scales it looks like it. So do you want me to finish off, or do you want me to leave it there, Dan?
I think it's great. Keep going.
Okay, so we have a stock, we have a flow, we have a feedback loop. Okay, and we have a single loop. It's a positive feedback loop. So generally speaking, positive feedback loops cause systems to run away from where they're at, to grow or decline. Okay, they sort of, in a sense, destabilize the system. Now, that's not entirely true. Forrester, the creator of system dynamics, showed us once a positive loop in a physical servo mechanism device he created that stabilized the system, and the U.S. Patent Office originally rejected it, saying you can't have a positive loop that stabilizes anything. And he went back to them and said, that's the innovation. And he ended up getting the patent. So, but generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, self-reinforcing processes, bathtubs that create more of themselves, people make more people, money makes more money, plant and equipment makes more plant and equipment, technology makes more technology, creates exponential growth. But that's not the end of the story. We have limiting factors, so you might say max people. Like I get on the elevator at WPI with the kids and the thing says maximum of 25 people. Of course, the kids don't want to wait for the next elevator, so they cram as many kids in as they can, right? And it's like, well, the maximum we can fit in here, folks, is, well, I suppose you could lay down and stack us, but it says 25 on the sign. So we're going to make a people ratio here.
I see you can
And all that's saying is,
like,
sorry?
I see you can change the colors in there. Like that one, those feedback loops are red, but it looks like if you click on them, you can change them to any color. Is that right?
You bet. So yeah, you can, and the fonts and all that stuff, you can customize it any way you want. So I made a ratio here of how many do I have and what's the max I can fit on my planet or in my car or my elevator. There's lots of limiting factors in the world, right? You got a limit on your credit card, presumably. You have physical limitations, you have cognitive limitations. And so we look for limiting factors. And then we can say that, well, this fertility coefficient, what we're going to do here is we're going to change things up just a little bit. And we're going to say that I would like a normal fertility coefficient. So what are things when everything is sort of unaffected by other parts of the system? And so now we're back to fertility coefficient over there. So we just replaced it with a new one. And so the fertility coefficient, the normal is now it's 0.02, going back to our 0.05. Let's make it 0.05. And let's say that now your fertility coefficient is the normal times the effect of something. So there's some crowding or limiting factor here. It could involve fossil fuels pollution. I don't know, whatever's going on, right? And so as long as this is low, the ratio of this to this is low. In other words, we're not nearing any limiting factor. Then this is going to leave this alone. But as this gets close to its max, presumably something bad is going to happen, or there's going to be some input. And let's make it nonlinear here. Okay, so we're going to make a very simple function here. Something like this. And you'll say, well, when the ratio is 0, leave it alone. 1 means leave it alone, leave it alone, leave it alone, leave it alone. And once we get out a little ways here, as we start heading towards the maximum, the effect starts to get bigger until at when you max out, you stop. So now if we rerun, you can see we get to a very different behavior. In this case, we smoothly head to the limiting factor. So in this case, it could be not maximum people, but maximum amount of stuff you want in your coffee cup. And somebody's filling it up for you. And you say, I want a full cup, a half cup, and you stop when you get to the limit or your target or what you'd like. Okay, so to sum up, we have a stock, we have a flow, we have a positive feedback loop, we have a negative feedback loop. This is a negative loop. I should have mentioned that. It's a stabilizing factor. And the positive and negative loops fight to see who controls the system. So if you look over here, there was a positive feedback loop at this region. The positive loop was dominating, and then the negative loop takes over and it dominates. It's goal seeking. It's a servo mechanism. It's trying to hit the target, or in this case, stop when we reach the maximum. Okay. So a couple things. Where is the shift in feedback loop dominance? This is only true of nonlinear systems. So we have a nonlinearity here. Okay. So if it's a linear system, it can't do this. But nonlinearities cause shifting feedback loop dominance. Where does it occur? Well, one way to do it, the easy way to do it, is to find out where the flow here is max. Really, it's a net flow. And we can see that it maxes out right here. So that's where the shift and feedback loop dominance is, where the green curve peaks. That's one way to do it. But this is a very simple model, so it's quite easy to figure that out. But we have had software advancements now when we want to look at modeling from a feedback loop perspective. We have loops that matter, and you can see here that the software is going to tell us which loops are dominating and actually and when. Okay, and you can see that at the beginning, it's the positive loop is dominating, and at the end, the negative loop is dominating. And up here, you can again see, where things peak and so forth. So with a complicated model, you need this sort of solution in order to diagnose why something's happening, because it's happening because of the feedback loops.
So, Mike, I got a question. If you could bring that up again. And
okay.
Pull the fly out of the the aggressive exponential drop off. It's it was in the top right hand corner.
Sorry, over here.
Oh, we got to show it. Yeah, up in the top right, it was a fly out, and you had a graph, an exponential fall off. It was what you said.
Was the effective people
ratio
on facility.
The feedback loop dominance, you mean?
Yeah.
Sorry, over here you mean?
Yeah, but there was a different one where you actually set the aggressive nature of the. There was a slider for you.
It's the effective people ratio on fertility, Mike. That one.
Oh, I'm sorry. The table function. Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
exactly.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So my point is that is one of the early detection mechanisms is that when the rate of change starts to increase. I mean, I'm not saying you're instability, but if you're fairly linear and you start to come, and that tangent starts to come off, isn't that an early detection mechanism for something that's changing within a system?
Yeah, Steve made the point last week that it's really not velocity, it's acceleration. The change in the change that gives you some important information about systems. So I guess that's a sort of a different way of answering what you're asking me. But I think, that's so. If you're looking for clues, which is kind of what you're saying here, this is sort of a theoretical device, although it's not ridiculous, right? It says, look, when the tub is full, when the stock is full, shut it off. Don't put any more in. And when it's empty, go ahead and at your normal rate. And at some point, you got to get from here down to here. Now, how you do that? The shape, you can have different assumptions about the shape. But yeah, when you're the sort of thing, you wouldn't necessarily be seeing this in the real world, but you would be you'd have data on something like that, right? And so you'd be trying to ascertain.
What I thought was incredibly intuitive is if you pull that graphic up in the top right-hand corner again. Yeah, it's like this to me represents, I guess, like economics in general, more of a flat line. These are things that we're used to seeing. They're, basically the boat's floating in the water the way it's supposed to. But then as it starts to open up and drop off, that's very telling to me about, potential tipping points and in an economic model, right? Like.
Yeah. So sorry to interrupt, but when you say tipping point, that's another way of saying shifting feedback loop dominance, right? And depending on how aggressive that is and abrupt it can be a deep plunge, not just in the green curve, but even in the blue curve here. So that's the state of the system. That's people, right? So if that blue curve is plunging, that would indicate if it's for the global system, they're either all going to Mars or they're dying.
Right? Yeah, I guess that would be very bad. Something like a prudent strategy would be to say, hey guys, if you're going to keep doing business as usual, it would be at least prudent to put in measures that when it goes, because it will go.
Yeah, identify potential tipping points and so. Yeah, absolutely, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Anyways, that's a more roundabout way of where I wanted to get on that. I want to remind everybody to subscribe to the channel. If you're watching it on YouTube, then put your comments in, not only in the not only in the live stream conversation, but put them in the actual chat as well. That's also helpful and keeps the YouTube algorithm pointed to not only Steve but also his friends. The Twitter show, I'd like you to continue to tune into that, into Twitter. If you're watching it on Twitter, come over to YouTube. I think it's a higher resolution show. So, anyways, I don't want to drag on about that, but
So Dan, I have a question. I have a couple other things to show, but I don't want to dominate things. Should we go over to Steve now, or
Yeah,
yes,
pop in a mean. We'll bounce between each other, mate. I've got two models I want to show.
Good.
Okay.
Good, yeah.
Well, that was very, very useful. And what I want to do now is show why I use what I use Minsky for. I'm trying my entire screen here and I'm waiting for it to. It's not letting me do share. So what's wrong here? Let's see. Hang on a second. I'll drag that down here and just try again here. Entire screen. Okay, so now I've got the screen I want to show. Got too many objects open there. So this is Ravel, which is also Ravel is the commercial software we're building on top of Minsky. Minsky being the System Dynamics program. The thing which makes Minsky different to any other program is this thing we call a godly table. You can now see I've got it attached to the screen here. I'm going to zoom in. Obviously, that's just an icon. I'm now going to change it to being what we call editor mode, so you can actually see the thing on screen here. And the thing that no other program does is handle financial flows using the world's first GUI, which was the accountant's idea of double entry bookkeeping. Assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero. And that's evolved ever since I wanted to model money properly. I found it really difficult to do it properly in the flowchart software that Mike was showing off a moment ago. And I realized I could do it using tables. And this actually came out of when I was working next door to Wingodly in Hyman Minsky's office in the Bard College when I was writing Debunking Economics. And then I finally got a grant from INET to bring this into reality. And this is Minsky. Now, what I want to show is something which I had yet another person making this case to me a couple of days ago, that if you borrow money from a bank and you've got to pay interest, you can never pay it back because you borrow the money, you've got to pay the money back plus the interest, and you get caught in a collapse. And that's a very common belief, and it's completely wrong because it confuses two things with Mike was very strong about there, talking about earlier, which stocks and flows. You add flows to stocks, so you don't confuse one with the other. The people do it all the time. So this is now opening up the godly table. I'm going to make it a bit larger by zooming in. These are usual little software tricks we have. I'm holding down the control key and pressing the scroll bar to make that larger. So what you do in Minsky, in the godly table, you record your assets beneath the asset heading here. You record your liabilities beneath the liabilities, obviously. And the remnant, what the gap between the two, is your equity. So I'm going to call this banks underscore E for equity, which now gives me a subscript there. So I'm starting off with a situation the person said to me in this discussion we had on a blog just recently. It'll be going live in a short while. But let's say somebody has lent you $100 and you have $90 in your bank account, and the bank has $10 in equity. And that's what's actually necessary. Every line must sum to zero. So assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero, even in the initial conditions of the program. So now we've got the idea of new loans, or new let loans, I'm going to call it here. And I'm going to call that credit. So credit dollars per year is added to your debt. And of course, the only reason you accept that you owe the bank extra money is that they put that money into your bank account. That's all there is to endogenous money creation. Okay? Bank originated money and debt. That's what sensible people like myself and Mike and the modern monetary theory crowd and the circuit has been trying to get through the thick skulls of neoclassicals. You don't lend from reserves. Bank lending creates money. Now, I've got loans that we've now got to pay interest on loans. And that's going to mean you've got to take money out of your deposit account and pay it to the bank. And the only way to make this make sense is it goes into the equity, the net worth of the banking system. And Minsky is now making sure that each line sums to zero. So that's the situation that people put to me and say, well, this is unsustainable, and they're right because they're wrong. And I'm sure Mike can see what I've left out, but I'll keep on going here. But having done that, I can now bring down our little browser window here, and I can now place these elements on the screen. And I'm going to have a very simple, almost Friedmanite argument that the money GDP is money times velocity of circulation. And I'm going to just treat deposits as money. I'm not going to look at the contribution of the bank as yet. I can do that later if I need to. Now, velocity, I'm going to make into a parameter and give that a value of, say, 2. So money turns over twice per year, maximum 4 times a year, minimum of half a year, a step size of 10%. And if I now multiply velocity by deposits, I'm now going to get GDP. And I can put the multiplier in there several ways. I can simply take a multiply block from down here and attach those on screen. And people, if you're comparing what you saw with Stella to what Mike was showing earlier, one of the distinctive features of Minsky is the equations are actually on the canvas. You can put them in groups if you want to, but they're not locked behind text boxes. That's one thing I didn't like about Stella and other programs like that. So I designed it so everything is visual on the screen. And now I've got that, I've got GDP.
Hey, Steve, I have a question at this point.
Yes.
When when you pulled up, I think you were building out the velocity, and I mean, just like Mike, you guys know the settings so intuitively.
Too well. Yeah.
And so somebody just starting off with that, how would they know what settings to, like, you almost did that so quickly. And
That's a very good point. Partly it's suck it and see, and this is actually one reason that the little button up here, the recalculate button. I'll show you that in more practical detail than the other model I want to illustrate, which is Goodwin's model of cyclical growth, and how you can start with a range of crazy parameters and get down to something more worthwhile. But I'll just bring that window back up again. You are right, Mike and I do this far too quickly. Let's just take a look at that edit window here. So this is editing a parameter. That's its name. I can change it from being a constant to a parameter to a flow to an integral if I need to. The units, I should be putting in what the units are, and this is how often money turns over per year. This is a straight constant in that particular case. I can rotate it. I can give it a description. Call this. And then I can give maximum and minimum values down here. I can change them using, little clicks like that if I need to, etc., etc. And having done that, when I'm now running the program, notice there's a dot there. Whoops, pardon me. I can drag, let's see. I can drag the dot using the mouse, or more practically, I just hold down the arrow key and I press the arrow key and I can change the values as I go around. So generally speaking, what Mike and I do when we intuitively set up a model like this is we use numbers that are realistic. We're not trying to maintain a crazy assumption of equilibrium here. Okay? So we try to get models that, you know how roughly fast population grows, you know what a carrying capacity is. You work it out by talking to the experts in the field. But that's the basic idea. Now what I want to do is say interest. So I bring an interest down here on the screen. Of course, interest, the amount of money you pay on the debt you owe, and the debt you owe is the loans. If I had loans here, I now need to bring in the interest rate. To multiply loans by the interest rate will give me interest. So I'm going to type, and you see I'm just typing straight on the screen here, interest rate underscore, which gives us a subscript, curly brackets, rate, which means put everything inside the curly brackets into a subscript. And now I've defined another entity, and I'm going to make that a parameter. Of course, in a more complicated model, I can make that a variable that depends upon other values in the system. And I'll set it at 5% initially, with a maximum of, say, 20%, and a minimum of 0, just to illustrate the impact of it there, and a step size of 0.01, which is 1%. So having done that, I've now got interest rate attached to my mouse. I come over here and click here. Now I can simply just type the multiply key on the keyboard, and it will turn up where the mouse is. And now I multiply loans by interest, and that's your interest payments. And notice you've got loans of 100, interest rate of 5%. So your interest payment is 5% per year. Now let's add a graph that Mike also did. Click on the graph icon here, bring this down here. I can now take a copy of interest by just the old Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste. and that attach that up there to show interest. And let's also see what's in the bank account. So I'll bring down the bank's equity and the deposits, and we can now see what happens to the two of those. I'll move this window out of the way for the moment. Put another chart on here, wire that up to here, the top insight, and that one to the red. Move it around a bit. So now we're going to see what happens if you borrow money from the bank and you don't, you run out of money. And let's see what happens. I run the system, hit the run button, and there you go. There's the deposits are falling, bank's equity is rising. You're going to head towards, you just watch the number here. This is going to turn negative in a short while. Okay. Now, I'll let Mike have the pleasure of telling everybody what I've done wrong here. What have I left out, mate?
Well, looks okay.
No, come on. I haven't included the bank doing any spending. Okay. Because what
Well,
people
yeah, it
leave
depends
out
on
of,
what you're trying to show.
Hey,
Yeah.
Steve,
Yeah, I
let
was
me
just
let me
saying-
interrupt before we go into that one. Let's address this question from Jean Noel Avila. Okay, about the equations. There's always a tension as to whether or not whether defining a ratio equation by dividing two quantities makes sense on a physical basis. I don't know what he's asking.
It's totally okay. Yeah, that's a lot of work in system dynamics uses ratios. I'm not actually using them here, so it doesn't really matter. But that, like the whole system dynamics behind limits to growth, is based on a whole series of interacting ratios. You get the same in the Cairo identity for climate change and so on. But that's a bit too technical. Let's leave it there. Now, all I've done is have look, the bank spends. So I've now got to include what their spending is. So I'm going to bring up spending by the banks here. Bring that window back up here so I can put spending on the system. So spending by the banks, I'm going to relate to the amount of money they've got in their bank account. Like a copy of banks, I'm not going to have a spend rate, or let's say spend subscript curly brackets rate and superscript banks. And let's say the banks, let's make this a parameter. Let's say they spend everything in their account per year. So their account turns over once per year. And with a maximum of, say, twice per year, but a minimum of, say, just 10% per year. And I'm now going to multiply banks by spend. And that tells me that if banks have $10 in their account and they spend that once per year, they're going to spend $10 per year. Now, notice what's going on here. I'll make it a smaller number. I'm going to make it down to, say, 10%. So they spend a very small amount. So banks start off with $10 in their accounts, so only spend $1 per year. They're earning $5. So their interest level earning is going to grow over time. So if I simulate this model, looks like it's going the same way. But if you take a look at the numbers up here, you'll see spending is gradually rising up to the point where it equals the interest payments, because as more and more of the money turns up in the bank's accounts, they've got more to spend, and therefore the system will stabilize. So the whole idea that people think, oh, you can't repay the debt because it compounds, because the bank lends you 100, charges you 105, you've only got 100. Those are stock flow confusions. When the bank lends you 100, and that's what I'm starting off with over here. Let's go back to the beginning again. Well, you've got 90. You start with 90. The loan is 100. You've got a deposit of account of 90, so you're in negative equity of 10.
You went silent, Steve, there for a minute.
Oh, did I? Oh, pardon me.
Yeah, it's
Back
okay.
again. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is $100 borrowed. $90 you've got in your account, turns over twice per year. You're spending $180 per year. Out of that, you've got to pay $5 interest. It's a breeze. Now, it's not saying that debt is sustainable. Obviously, it's not. But it's not just a simple idea that if you lend 100, you've got to pay 105 back. You can never do it. The system crashes. That is just a stock flow confusion. And that's why people like Mike and I use system dynamics in the first place, to get away from those stock flow confusions.
Right.
So
It's hard to keep organized, right? You have to. I mean,
Yeah.
it's very hard to keep organized, and you've caught yourself a couple times, especially when you describe how difficult it is, or non-intuitive, anti-intuitive it is to understand exponential growth or decay. It's hard. It's even hard. Steve has said it's even hard for him to wrap his head around it. We're just not, as a species, wired to understand the lilies in the pond. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah.
Can I say a few words about stock flow confusion, because I think this is super important. Let's say that our viewers today are not necessarily interested in becoming system dynamics modelers. I hope they would, but not everybody has the time or the interest in going that deep into the well. But what could they take away from even what we've shown so far? And that's the difference between stocks and flows. And that is super important. So when you're listening to somebody describe something or reading an article in the paper or something, among the things you might be thinking of, is that a stock thing they're talking about or a flow thing? And if they're talking about a policy change, is it impacting the stock, the flow, or both? And it matters a great deal. Now, most people do not know the difference between a stock and a flow and often confuse the two. They'll use deficit and debt interchangeably. They'll use wealth and income interchangeably.
Yep.
Right? They'll think about a balance sheet and an income statement kind of in their mind, sort of the same thing, because it's numbers on a piece of paper. But the balance sheet are stocks, and the P&L and cash flow statement are flows. They'll say inflation has gone down, so prices are going down. No, they're going up more slowly. So just knowing the difference between stocks and flows, right then and there, you're like way ahead of the population at large, and you don't have to do any modeling or anything like that. Now, one thing that often muddies the water even more, and economists like to do this, is they'll show up with stock and flow data. It really was Irving Fisher, as far as I can tell, was the first economist to bring stocks and flows in 1898 into economics. So economists have known about stocks and flows for a long time, right? And so you can convince economists, like, okay, I get it. Stocks and flows create dynamics, cool. And the concept's been around a long time. And they'll show up with stock flow data. And they'll say, load this into your system dynamics model, and let's see if your model can mimic the data. And it almost never can exactly. Okay, it can qualitatively, but it won't match it exactly. And say, look, we put in let's say you have production data, inventory data, and sales data for a company or whatever, right? And they'll say literally load in the production data, start inventory at the exact value from the spreadsheet, and now here's your sales data. Now run your model, and let's compare the inventory and sales driven by the actual production numbers. And they don't match exactly. So then you hear, this sucks, this is wrong, your software's crap, and whatever. It's like, no. The flows that Steve and I are showing are instantaneous rates of change at a moment in time, sort of the Roy Harrod idea. Whereas flow data that you get has a stock and an accumulation process somewhere in its calculation. Think about it. Monthly data on sales, which is a flow idea, is the first week's sales plus the second week's sales plus the third week's sales plus the first week's. Weekly data is sales data is Monday's sales plus Tuesday's sales plus one. Monday's sales data is 8 o'clock sales plus 9 o'clock sales plus 10 o'clock sales. The 8 o'clock hours sales are 8:01 sales plus 8:02 sales plus there. So when you go down into the limit, of dividing time. So every time I said plus, there's a stock in there in the calculation of the actual data, flow data. So it's not going to match identically the flow concepts that we're showing here with the software. And you say, well, it's a model, it's not real. So you got it, but some economists cannot get past that.
Yeah, most of them can't. I mean, one of my favorite there is I think it was one of Kittleman and Prescott, but it's one of those real business cycle nutcases, and they looked at the empirical data for America's private debt to GDP ratio, which is described in the literature as credit to GDP ratio. Okay, now Mike, debt is a stock, credit is a flow. And he looked at it and said, look, it was high before and it's the same level after, so it can't be credit that caused the crisis. He was looking at the stock. Credit went from, which is the rate of change of debt, went from plus 15 to minus 6% of GDP. He didn't even see it. He literally, this is a refereed article in the American Economic Review to say why private debt didn't cause the financial crisis because it was high before and high after, and not much of a change. Therefore, it can't have caused the crisis. He was looking at the stock and confusing it with the flow.
So just to hop in here, She Watches has said, all models are wrong, some are useful. That's the famous quote by, I think, George Box, the statistician. And that's absolutely positively true. Models are not real. They're really just our formal mental representations. Like we have models inside of our head, right? We don't have an actual family or corporation or state or club, university, church, whatever in our head. We have mental representations of these things, mental models. So we use models every day. Humbly, all we're doing here is taking what's up here and writing it, making it formal with equations and stuff. But that doesn't make it true. Hopefully, you're going to use your mental model anyway. So why don't you see if the computer can aid you in thinking through some of your own ideas?
And that's what Ty's running in the background. There are some of his models done in Minsky, incredibly sophisticated models, much more complicated than we're building here. That's an important point because you can build extremely sophisticated models of the real world and using the software, not limited to toys as we're doing right now. But an important part of that is sometimes what happens in the system will not be what you think is going to happen. So, Mike, I might dive straight into my Goodwin model here and then let you take the show out in that case, if you like, because I want to show building a Goodwin model in Minsky and then what I discovered when I included private debt, which was Hyman Minsky's innovation or concept, and talking about knowing what's actually going on. Goodwin and Minsky worked at the same bloody university and didn't like each other. This is Washington, University of Washington. And no, they can't handle PDEs. That's a good question from Philip Burns here. Can Minsky handle PDEs? No, all these programs are ODEs only.
ODEs.
Same for you? Yeah, ordinary
ODEs.
differential equations.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, an ordinary differential equation covers a process normally changing through time, which is a single dimension. A partial differential equation will be time and space. And of course, that's vital for remodeling the stuff that Tony normally talks. It doesn't look like Tony's here today. But that's for anything which you're building an object in, putting up a communications tower is both time affected by wind and space, how one component fits in with another. So partial differential equations are essential for that sort of work. We don't provide those. It'd be feasible to add them, but in general speaking, economic models are just through time alone, if they are at all. Most of them leave time out with this nonsense of equilibrium. So there are deficiencies in what we're modeling compared to what an engineer would use for a practical physical system. Well, let's take a look at building Goodwin's model in Minsky now. And this is the one that Marx literally dreamt up but didn't actually get into a final model. So I'm going to start just by typing in, hang on, whereabouts is my mouse here? Okay. So I'm going to type output. So I'm going to have a variable which is called output. Just going to place it on the screen. And I'm now going to divide output by the output to labor.
Hey, Steve, can you hear me? This is the producer of the show here. I don't mean to stop you in this very important process of probably one of the most famous growth cycle models, in my opinion, on the planet. But we need Dan to get you to do the top chatters before you build this model. Okay, so I didn't want Dan to cut you off because I feel bad when he does that, and I'm pretty much making him do that in the background. So we're going to do the top chatters next. So Dan, take it away.
Well, I mean, that was the voice of God there behind us, directing the traffic towards, ready for it? The top chatters list, which are going to be read by Steve.
By me? Okay.
Yeah.
HPB, Eurojaro, Algorithm, Kathleen Smith, From Where I'm Standing, Syndicat, Nobby Clark, Neil Bryson, Jim Roberts, Big Hammer, Here in Queer and Peggy, Danger Zone, Stavros Karagiorgis, Josh Bockham, Nicholas Gomez, Connor Howell, Teddy Bruschi, Political Economy 101, D. Smith, Rick O'Brien, Dreg Eye, Murphy, Randall McMurphy, Bob Liori, Peter Kame, Nicholas Gomez, Genrik Lukianchuk, Circuli Economici, Ghost on the Half Shell, Larry Summers, TR, Jovianar, Tony Wilson, Petrified Produce, Alpinism Utilitar, Economics in One Lesson, Patrick Lovell, Bill Goggin, and David Fields.
Very nice. I think, Steve, you've got the nice warmed up vocals there, because that was very well pronounced, and you didn't stumble once, so you earned that applause.
I think I came close to George's, but anyway, I'm going to actually, given our time, I'm going to just quickly start putting this together and stop at a certain point, then load another program where I've already put it together. But one reason that I like Minsky, as opposed to what happens with Stella and so on, you can actually see the equations you're building on the canvas, and I think that's a great advantage. So output divided by output labor ratio is going to give you labor. And then I just click onto the OK here and attach that. So now I've got labor, and if I divide labor by population, I'm going to make them parameters. I should make them variables with population growth, but it just makes it easy to start a simple model this way. We'll say maximum value, local current value of 100, maximum of 1,000, minimum of 100, step size of 10, so I can change this later if I need to. If I divide labor by population, I now have the employment rate. And now with the employment rate, I'm going to have what I'm going to call it wage change zero, meaning there's an employment rate at which wages don't change. This is the classic Phillips curve argument. I'm happy to defend Phillips against anybody on the planet if we need to. So let's say this is when 60% of the population has employment, wages don't change. Maximum of say 70%, minimum of 40%, step size of 1%. So I can vary this if I need to later. And now if I subtract the employment, so it's that the wage change where wages don't change from the employment rate, I've got the gap between the level at which will give you equilibrium and the actual level of employment. And I'm going to have wage change. This is going to be a very simple linear equation here. So wage change slope, and make that another parameter. Again, a range of values, current value 10, maximum 20, minimum 1, step size of 1. So I can modify these things later. And then I multiply wage change slope by the wage change. I now have the rate of change of wages. And I'm going to type capital D ELTA, which the program will change into delta, the Greek delta, which again is something none of the other programs seem to support. So there's now the change in wages, and now's where stocks and integrals come inside, because this is the rate of change of wages, and then need wages to be what might call the stock, which I'm going to call an integral, exactly the same thing, just a different way of representing it. So I click on the integrate block here, and I bring this down, and I now right click here and edit the name, and I'm going to call this wage, as in the money wage. And I'm going to have an initial wage the system starts up, which I'm going to call wage subscript 0. Make that a parameter, of course, and set that at 1. Again, give myself a nice large range to play with in case I make a mistake or I've chosen bad values. So I feed that into the bottom of the integral block, and that gives me the initial value. And then I have to have the wage change multiplied by what the wage currently is, and that's going to multiply those two together, that is going to be the wage. So you have the rate of change of wages multiplied by the wage currently is integrated and added to the initial wage is the wage rate. Now, at that point, believe it or not, that's enough to define a cyclical model of capitalism, because if I now take, say, the wage here and I multiply the wage by labour.
Hey, Steve, I have a question quickly.
Yeah.
How come there's no units in your parameters?
I haven't bothered putting there for the sake of time. You should be using units all the time. And like of Ty, he does that beautifully in his Minsky models. So he's making sure the units are correct. If I was doing that, I made a mistake, I might stuff up the program. So I'm trying to get things done more quickly. So you don't have to define units, but it is wise to do so. But there's wages now. And once I've got wages, I've got output up here. So I can take a copy of output. And if I subtract wages from output, and that's going to give me profit. Okay, and now I'm going to make the simple assumption that Goodwin made when putting his model first together, is that all profits are invested.
Partial differential equation, Steve. Thomas wants
Yeah, I
to
think
know.
it's a good question. I think it could, but economics is so primitive right now that getting it to handle time properly would be a great advance. Space is another issue again. That's later for talking about it later, but it is a good idea, and we can talk about how it might be done. Now, there was investment as the rate of change of capital stock. So I'm now going to edit this one and call this capital. And I'm going to have an initial level of capital, which I'll call capital subscript 0.
How did you create that delta again?
I'll show you that in a second, mate. Look at, say, value of 100, maximum of 1,000, minimum of 50, let's say, step size of 10. I'll add that in the bottom here. I'll just show you by typing it on screen. If I type the / key and the capital letter DELTA, Minsky interprets that as the Greek letter delta. So we're using what's called LaTeX, which is the mathematical formatting language. So now I've got delta. Okay, nice. That's all there is to it. Okay, so if I type / LAMBDA, for example, and I'll just place these on screen for the heck of it. There's lambda. So we're the only program that handles superscripts, subscripts, and Greek letters, which is quite crazy given how new Minsky is. Anyways, I've got investment coming in here. That's the rate of change of the capital stock. I've now got capital, and if I now divide by the capital output ratio, and make that, so again, give that a range of values. So I'm going to say it's the usual value people use for it is, say, 4. So value of 4, or value of 3, actually. And then say maximum of 6, minimum of 1, step size of 0.1. We now divide capital by the capital output ratio. Now here's a bug. So we need to record this one and pass it on to Russell. Sometimes you can't draw a wire out of the first time you define the integral block. So I'm going to cheat and put it up there. We've got to get rid of that bug before we distribute distribution. And now, notice I've now got output. Now, you'll now notice numbers have turned up all the way through the system. So what's actually happened is now that all these units are defined, I've gone from output to labour ratio to labour, by population to the employment rate, wage change to wages, the wage rate times labour to give you a wage bill. Subtract from output, you get profit, get investment. You've now got capital. So the whole thing holds together. And I've got some pretty crazy numbers. I've got employment of 33 of 1/3. So what I want to do is reduce the value for population. I've got population as low as it can go. I might just make the initial capital larger. So I'm pressing the up arrow key here. So it's now 200. Now I get a reasonable number for capital there. I'm just going to drag this down a bit. Let's whack a graph inside here. And let's take a look at the employment rate. and hit the run key. And we have a cyclical model.
Wow.
Okay. Now that's about how fast you reckon, Mike? About 60 times faster than building a DSGE model. So that's the advantage of system dynamics. It's just far. Not only is it a better way to model, it's a faster way to model when you learn how to put these things together. So that's doing a model in Minsky. And Mike, back over to you, and Dan.
Yeah. So you know that bug you pointed out, right? We recorded
Yeah.
it. I think it's easy enough to kind of chop it up and then send it to Russell.
Yeah,
But
I'll just put it on YouTube. So if somebody can write in the comments what time step that was roughly, or then I can send it to him and show him it's still turning up there.
yeah.
Steve, Steve, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is that the latest version of Minsky you're using, 3.2?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. I'm just going to check and see. It's crazy often this damn thing turns up, a particular bug. Yeah, 3.2. Yep.
All right. I will create a ticket via that video that was just made.
So curious if when you're building that model, could you just have deleted the one below and then moved the new duplicate version down and
No, because the one below with the integral block. The one below the integral block. So one thing which is two things about Minsky which make it different to the other system dynamics programs. First, we put our equations on the canvas so you can actually see the equations as you're building the whole system. And secondly, you can have multiple examples, multiple instances of a term somewhere. You don't have to wire everything up to one point. So, like I've got capital, I could have this in a. You notice that's not even connected to this one. Let's see if I can drag it out now. It still won't drag out. I think actually I've got to get right to the. Let's see.
Pretzels and
even
poop.
if I go
pretzels and poop. we had a pretzel
Can't
and
get
poop
it
right
out.
there.
Okay, so that's just a bug. This is what software is all about: finding bugs and getting the buggers to die. But sometimes they just keep on coming back to. This is definitely a zombie bug. We've killed it so many times, and it's still there.
It just keeps coming back. Okay, Mike. I think it's Mike's turn to talk a little bit more about his models, or how would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I got a bunch of stuff I can show, so let me
Yep.
Let me do that. Just real quickly, can you see what my model up here?
Yep.
Oh, okay, you can. So this is the same model more or less that Steve just did. Although I have the labor force growing, and I know Steve can do that with Minsky. He just explicitly said he wasn't going to do that.
Yeah.
Just saying, this is how you would do the same thing in Stella, right? You have Goodwin's wage share model. I think Steve has said elsewhere that this basic format is how any macro model he thinks should be created. I don't know if that's true. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I can actually derive this model from definitions, mate, straight from macro definitions. So to me, it's the fundamental, it's the basis of macroeconomics, this model.
Right. Wow. Okay. So so I thought you had said that. The other thing is we can see the equations, but Steve is absolutely right. We have to. They're not just on the screen like they are with Minsky. So that's a little bit of a different approach, I guess. What I wanted to do is show you a model I was working on earlier today in preparation for the program, and I'm afraid I didn't have enough time to finish it. So just bear with me now. I gotta find it here in my multiple screens.
Hey, Steve. Well, Mike's looking for that.
Okay.
Never mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, you got it. Yep.
Okay. So in preparation for today's show, I just ran out of time, but I was trying to think, what could I show everybody that would make sense for this audience and my colleagues and whatever. And so I just wanted to build a teeny little model here that represents the kinds of things that we worry about with stock flow consistent modeling and with properly integrating financials into our economic modeling, money into our economic modeling. So this is a super duper simple model that I just wanted to quickly take everybody through. So we have a firm sector and we have a household sector, and they're going to interact. Okay. And by the way, we can modularize these sectors if we want. We could name it and then plop the firm stuff and call this firm sector and put another one down here and call it household sector, and then connect these guys and then they interact in the exact same way. It's not as cluttered, but I didn't do that for today. Let me just get rid of that. So we have a firm sector and we have a household sector, as I mentioned. Now, one of the things that we do in system dynamics modeling, we work from the bottom up. We do what's called pattern modeling, which is done in heterodox economics. And that is, you start by not appealing to economic theory, but you start by looking at the real world. You are not a social science physicist, but rather you are a social science detective at a crime scene or a social science physician seeing a patient. And there's a problem here, and you're trying to diagnose, what is the problem. And so you're looking for clues. They're called themes in pattern modeling. And then you put the themes, the clues together into a coherent whole or explanation. So you, in a sense, tell a narrative or a story based on the clues, the themes. Here's what I think the disease is that the patient has, or what happened at the crime scene. If there's any generalities that we find in multiple crime scenes or multiple patients, those are called real typologies in pattern modeling. We call them generic structures in system dynamics. So what I'm getting at is, you can see here that these things are really the same kind of structure, more or less. They're not identical, but they're very similar, right? We're not reinventing the wheel every time we need to move something with an ox cart, right? We say the wheel's been invented and I'm going to use it. So what I have here is the firm sector makes widgets and ships them to the household sector, and they have a big closet full of them. And then they consume those widgets, whatever consumption means. We're not defining if it's a durable good or a non-durable good or what have you. How quickly do they consume them? Well, that's a function of the population and their consumption rate per person. And again, we have equations here. If we want to look at the equations, or if we want to look at, all the equations, as I said before, we can see them all here. We can print them out and whatever. Some fraction of the population is in the labor force. They work at a particular wage rate, generating a wage bill. Okay. When the household consumes its widgets, it wants to order more. Okay. And so it has to replace what it's losing. And it also says, well, I want to have so many items in my pantry or my garage, whatever the case may be, in inventory. So based on that, it places its orders. And this is a very simple model. Normally, we'd have like an order backlog that the firm would have to fill, work its way through its backlog. Those are orders awaiting being filled. But we're keeping it simple here. So they're just saying, look, this is what I'd like you to sell me. Okay. There's some feedbacks in here that say, when this is empty, stop shipping, because there's nothing to ship. That's all this stuff is saying. And it's the same thing down here. That's called first order control in system dynamics. The firm has to, again, as it's losing inventory, as it's shipping it to its customer sector, it has to replace what it's losing, plus keep the amount of inventory it would like on hand. Okay. How does it make the stuff? Well, the labor force times its productivity determines the production rate. Now, in this model, there's no ability the population doesn't grow and the labor force doesn't grow. So the firm, you'll see in a minute here, can get stuck by needing to make more, but productivity is frozen and the workforce is frozen, so they can only make so much. So the model's incomplete. So this is physical stuff, right? Physical people ordering physical things, and they're physical things being made. Now, we could have made inventory into a financial by saying, the book value of inventory, putting a price on it and adding that to a balance sheet. I didn't get that far, but you could do that. But down here, we do have some financials. Okay. And what I have here is that the household sector has a stock of cash. The firm sector has a stock of cash. There's no stock of debt. There's no borrowing. We could have put in, if I had a backlogged orders here, that would be an asset on the firm sector's balance sheet. Accounts receivable and accounts payable, I could have put in a stock of accounts payable. So the workers, they don't get paid instantly. They get paid every 2 weeks or something. So that's to pay its accounts payable. That's a liability for the firms. Accounts receivable, that would be an asset for the household sector. Their paycheck is coming. Going the other way, the household sector gets a bill it has to pay. So it would go into its accounts payable. That would be a liability for the household sector, and an accounts receivable for the firm sector. So we could put all that stuff in, but I didn't have enough time to do it. And it would, quite frankly, get rather complicated if we did that for our purposes today. But it's certainly possible. But down here, so the only assets are cash from the household and the firm sectors. The household sector is spending out of its stock of cash based on the price per widget and the purchase rate from up here. That's just a copy of it. I could have just drug a telephone wire down here, I guess. And then its spending goes over its revenue for the firm. Now, I could have made literally this flow going like this and going into here, but two ways of doing the same thing. And similarly, when the firm spends, the only thing it's spending on, it's not spending on energy, Steve. So there's a big deficiency in the model here, right? It just is using labor, no machines, no raw materials, no energy. And when it spends, it's just buying labor. Okay. And again, there's something that says when this is empty, you don't got anything to spend, don't spend. We could have had a stock of debt, which would be liabilities, and you could overspend and then you take on debt. So, and then it's an equilibrium, not because we believe real systems are in equilibrium or we want our models in equilibrium or we're searching for equilibrium, but it's a good starting point. And then what we do is we shock these things out and we see what happens when we shock them out. Does it make sense as we're testing and building a model? So here we're going to shock it out. Suddenly everybody wants more widgets. And you can see that there's a higher desire for purchases, production, and whatever, but the labor force is fixed. And so it can't, and the productivity is fixed, so it can't meet the higher demand that's exogenous here as a test input. So a more complete model would have, the labor force changing. It would be a stock, and the firm sector would be hiring more people if they were available. And now we get into limiting factors and what have you. The other thing I wanted to illustrate was, and then this is, again, very, very, very incomplete. I'll show you one that is working in a minute here. But what we do once we get a system dynamics model where we want it to be is we can make it into a game or what we call a flight simulator. The idea being you should train to help run via policy a social system like a pilot trains to fly an airplane. You're going to fly the economy, fly the city, fly the company, whatever the case may be. And so, again, I didn't have enough time, but as you can see here, we can in the interface, we can, and then once you launch it, there's no sliders or anything here, but you can see we can build godly tables and the like, and social fabric matrix tables and stuff in this environment. So taking this stuff and putting it into a very user-friendly format.
Hey, Mike, I got a question for you on this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first, it's going to be more of a broader question about the differential equations, but I'm curious about the space, that extra dimension.
Yes.
So I'm thinking that adding the dimension of space into economic models with partial differential equations would actually give geography points, or would allow for clustering on three-dimensional surfaces like, our planet, right? Is that intuitively the upgrade that would happen with a partial differential equation? And by bringing in space?
I think that the difference about the reason that it isn't done by economists is, apart from lacking knowledge of dynamics, which is the main reason, we tend to work in terms of countries, and what you then do when you have one country A trading with country B, you're teaching both countries as a sort of point with the transactions between them, which is bearable as an abstraction. If you really wanted to do the sort of sophistication that engineers do, then you would need to have partial differential equations, and you'd have a geographic information system lying beneath your system, telling you where the mines are and therefore where the revenue from mining emanates from, and there where the spending occurs, etc., etc. Economics is about a century away from that level of sophistication, and this is even talking about Mike and my stuff, let alone the garbage the neoclassicals pump out, where they have equilibrium forced on top of everything. Um, they treat the entire economy as a single commodity. We need to do multi-commodity production as well. In that sense, we do have potential for, all the models we've done here being single variable GDP. It's not, Minsky is designed to handle scalar mathematics, tensor mathematics, so we can handle multi-sectoral dynamics and so on. What about Stella, Mike? Is there strong capacity for tensor mathematics in Stella, or not so much?
So, well, I guess I could answer. I echo what Steve is saying, that you could make different sectors. As I mentioned before, we could have one sector is United States and rest of the world, or Canada, United States, and you have international trade, and these sectors would be trading with one another and what have you. So we can do all that in some sense spatially, but it's still using ODEs. The real way that this stuff is handled these days in system dynamics is to sort of interface with a geographic information system. So you have, let's say, Stella or Vensim or PowerSim driving a GIS program. To my eye, it gets a little clunky at some point. And at some point you say, why don't you just use any logic where they got all that stuff seamlessly integrated in one place? Because as soon as you have software platforms talking to one another, it gets rather dicey sometimes. But using partial different, that I don't know enough about partial differential equations to say, could that replace what we're doing that I've just described?
I would say that
I think it'd be fine. What Tony often talks about is finite element analysis would be what you'd be doing in that particular case. So that's the way in which engineers have turned the mathematics of PDEs into something which can be simulated and catch a physical system.
Wow.
Yeah, that struck me a little bit like agent-based modeling, where each element would be an agent kind of thing, but I don't know enough about it to really weigh in aggressively.
We can talk about agents some other time. What am I, just in terms of getting close to time here, I might actually finish off by doing something people who like MMT might enjoy, and that's proving MMT using Minsky, and I mean proving. So how about I grab hold of the screen and do that for a tick?
Yeah, sure.
That's good.
Okay, so here we go. Hang on. Boom, entire screen, that one, share, get you guys out of the way. Okay, so here's now, I only showed one godly table beforehand, but I can have as many as I like. Well, let's put 4 on the screen here. And I'm going to rapidly label them all as fast as Minsky lets me do it. So this is going to be the banks. This is going to be the private sector. I'll call it NB for non-banks, meaning everybody who's not a bank. The central bank.
You mean lenders that are not banks, or?
Huh? No, I mean the non-bank public. I mean people, everybody who's not a bank. Okay? And then treasury.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So having done that, I'm going to put them all into edit mode so I can show them all on screen at once. So this is just, bear with me setting this up. So I've got the banks there, private non-bank system over there, treasury, and the central bank. Well, let's start with the banks. And what I'm going to look at now is I'm going to build the model in step by step. So you've got, of course, banks have deposits. And they also have reserves, which are settlement accounts. I'm going to ignore loans here, but obviously I can include loans quite easily. And then there's the banks, the net worth of the banks, so they're called banks subscript E for equity. And then let's say look at straight for the government. You have spending minus taxation, which we normally call the deficit, which happens to be a word I hate. But let's say all the government money spending is done on the non-bank sector, then you get deficit dollars per year being added to deposit accounts. That's the very first point. Government spending in excess of taxation creates money for the private sector. That's the first step of it. But to balance it, I have to show, well, where's the balancing item to bring this row to zero? And the answer is the government deficit increases the reserves that are owned by the banking sector as well. So now you've got, if I come across to this table, all I've done so far is show it from the point of view of the banking sector. Now bring up the private non-banks. And Minsky integrates everybody's assets and liabilities. So if I click in the wedge here, the down arrow, that tells Minsky to go and look for any liability which hasn't yet been made an asset for somebody else. If I click on the arrow, it'll show deposits, which is the only thing I've created there. The deposits now turn up as an asset for the private sector. I haven't put loans in there, so I won't have a liability for them yet. But of course, private NB equity and the deficit therefore increases the equity of the non-bank public. So rather than a deficit burdening the public, it's actually creating net assets, as MMT says, for the private sector. How is that all financed? I've now got just the deficit and seeing it from the bank's point of view and the non-bank public. Let's come across to the central bank now and bring up its table. I could edit it into place, but I tend to make a mistake when I work on that scale part. That's another model. Let's get rid of that. Okay, I click on assets. There's nothing actually allocated at the moment. But if I click on the down arrow for liabilities, that'll go looking for an asset that hasn't yet been made somebody's liability. Click there and reserves turn up. And now we see deficit is going to increase reserves. How is it funded? Well, the deficit is actually spending by the Treasury. So I'm going to call this the Consolidated Revenue Fund of Treasury. So that's the account that the Treasury has at the central bank. And if you're going to increase the deficit, that actually reduces the Consolidated Revenue Fund. Now I've got the integrated system from the point of view of the central bank. What about the Treasury? Let's bring up its table. Now, when I click in the down column for assets, I'm going to get the Treasury's account at the central bank as an asset. How do I balance the row? I've got to now with the Treasury equity. So this is the equity of the Treasury. And the only way to balance it is the deficit is financed by the Treasury going to negative equity. That's now the entire system. Now, what that's showing is that the government running a deficit creates negative equity for itself, negative financial equity, and positive financial equity for the private sector. And that's the basic idea of modern monetary theory. The government can afford to be in negative financial equity because it has thousands, tons and tons of non-financial assets, which, the military is a pretty obvious one to choose for America. There's enormous assets, real assets backing the government's power to create financial liabilities for itself, which create financial assets for the rest of the system. Now, what about the selling of bonds? How is bond finance? We simply say, well, the government is required by most. The government requires most treasuries to issue bonds equal to the deficit plus interest on outstanding bonds. So I'm going to have bond sales, treasury bond sales. Pardon me, making a typing mistake. Mike, you do this all the time. We're looking at two places at once, don't we? Now, what's going to happen?
You bet.
You've got to create another asset for the bank. This is bonds owned by the banking sector. That's going to go up. Okay, so you're going to have bonds being sold by the Treasury to the banks. And how's that financed? They use the funds created by the actual deficit itself. So that's how bond sales are financed. They're not. It's again. This is what Stephanie talked about. It turning, I think, red notes into green notes. You have debt reserves which earn no interest, and used to earn no interest, and you can't trade them, getting turned into bonds which earn interest and can be traded. The banks take that side of the deal. It's an asset swap. It's not creating any money. I'll leave it at that point because we're running a bit low on time here, but I can keep on going and show the basic logic of MMT is easily shown using Minsky. And once you look at it that way, there's no, forget about bond vigilantes. Bond vigilantes are people too stupid to take advantage of a good deal.
Good point. Investment advice from Steve Keane.
So I see some people ask for a game. Do I have time to quickly show
absolutely
the example of how we would use the system dynamics model, not just in a gaming environment, but how we don't use it for forecasting? Is that okay?
Yeah,
sure. You do that? Okay. All right. So bear with me 1 second here, and I will hopefully get things rolling properly. And hopefully we see the interface here. So this is not an economics model per se, but I think it's something everybody can relate to a pandemic. We recently had one. So this is based on a system dynamics model.
What program are you in?
This is still Stella.
Oh, it is. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So we can quite easily turn a model into a game. And so, I try to do sort of the same thing with all of my games. There should be some learning objectives here. So I'm not an epidemiologist, obviously, so I'm not going to claim this is the be all end all of epidemiological models, but rather it's a way of illustrating, how we turn models into games and then how we use system dynamics models. So there's some background information about, what a pandemic is and what have you here. I'm not going to read it to everybody, but you allow the player to, get some background information. But quite importantly, in system dynamics, we always say we don't model the system. We model a problem from a system's perspective. So the way we always begin a modeling intervention is to say, in plain English or whatever your language is, what is the problem? Because the problem will help us simplify, help us to decide what should be in our model and what should be left out of our model. Okay, because we're not trying to model everything, including the kitchen sink. It gets out of control. Okay, so in this case, if you remember the COVID pandemic, there was big talk, at least at the beginning, about flattening the curve. So here we have a curve that is not very flat, right? The daily number of cases of the disease, right? And then over here is, with protective measures, it says, I just fetched this from the internet. Here's what we want. So we want to flatten the yellow curve into this, I guess, gray curve over here. Okay, so how do we get from here? That's the problem. And here's defined as better. We haven't solved it, right? It's not that there's no cases, but rather we've made things better. We're not overwhelming the hospitals. And then here was some actual data that confirmed these time shapes. So then we say in system dynamics that structure causes behavior. So what do we mean by that? Stocks and flows and feedback loops and limiting factors. So there's a bunch of chit chat about that. And then we explore the model structure. Okay, so now we have, this is standard in epidemiology, susceptible people, they haven't gotten it yet, but they might get it, the disease. Those who have it and can pass it to others, so they have to interact with the folks who don't have it. And there's some chance that you're going to run into somebody. And then if you run into them, there's some chance that you'll pass the disease. Some people pass away and some are recover from the disease. At the time, if you remember, there were issues about in-migration, either from state to state or from outside the country into the country, right? And one policy space was, what will we do if we reduced or banned in-migration to wherever, our country, our state, our region, whatever. There is also some structure related to what the reference mode talked about is preventative measures. 6 feet of separation, wearing masks, and this sort of thing, staying home if you're not feeling well. And I also put in some fake news effects here where people might be skeptical of some of these things or not. We can try quarantining people. So if you have it, we say, no, you can't interact with people. WPI put the kids into a hotel if they had it.
Mike, I have to ask, did you give a unit to skepticism? That would be a cool thing to derive.
Yeah, skepticism units.
1 SK, SK1, SK2. Okay, go on.
Yeah. Yeah, some of these things you just have to define a scale for, right?
Right.
And then you can also vaccinate people. Okay. And then some diseases, you can get them again after you recover. COVID being one of them. Okay. So then after you understand the model structure, you can run simulation experiments. And we try to get people to run them properly, which you don't. So all this chit chat here is about how do you use a simulation model, a simulation game properly. So the way to do it properly is, number one, we go up here. This is the disease, and you can set it up any way you want. So how long on average are you sick? Do you die from it? You can make it 0. Nobody dies from it versus everybody does, or something in between. Do you get immunity, complete immunity, or some fraction lose immunity? How likely is it that you'll run into somebody if you live in a densely situated area, a big city versus you live in the country? And then how much interaction do you need to pass it? Do you just have to breathe the same air, or do you have to interact much more aggressively to pass the disease? So what you want to do is set this up for whatever disease you want, then leave it be when you run your simulation experiments. So like a pilot, you go to the cockpit and you want to run the model once to get a base run. So we say we can name it. We'll call this base. And that's, we want to compare. See, it says base over here. Compare one against the other. Okay, so in this case, you see we have that big overwhelming the hospitals situation. If you can't remember, you can go to the reference mode. This is the bad. So is our base run mimicking the problem? Now we have an explanation for the problem, right? So, I guess, sorry, in this version, it deletes it. So let me just run it again real quick here. So then you can start running what if scenarios. So we have to go back to simulation setup and say, well, what if we, what if we banned people from coming into the country? What happens now? So let's run the model again. And you see it compares it. So we can say that this would be, an in-migration policy. So it shifted things in time. It flattened it a little bit, but not really. It's not really what we're after, right? So the idea at the beginning is one thing at a time. Let's see if we can find something that works, but don't start just switching buttons left, right, up, and down, or sliders left, right, up, and down. And we don't want to change the type of disease it is, right? That's going to mess us up. How about if we quarantine people? How many can we quarantine? Now, one aspect of this is, what if we can quarantine 100% of the people? Yeah, but realistically, what could we quarantine? Maybe it's 50%. I don't know. Let's try that. Now, my mental model kind of said that probably would have worked pretty well, but, not the greatest. And well, you're getting the idea. We'll just run one more and then I'll return to the net control here. What if we?
Well, I'm sorry, Mike. I missed if you did that. The first one, did you return it back to its neutral state or starting condition, or is it
Yeah, it
still
automatically
at a high?
does it.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right.
Yeah, when it goes back, I ask it to do that. So we can try. Let's vaccinate everybody. What the heck? How does that do? Okay, that's much more effective. So you get the idea here is you use the model to try and redesign the airplane, to institute policies or turn on pieces of structure that potentially could be effective. Now, I say potentially because just because somebody's claiming it's going to be effective doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be effective, right? So you have to, with these complex systems, try and figure out what policy or policy mix might be effective. So we're not trying to predict the future. We're not trying to predict how many COVID cases there's going to be or what have you. We're trying to see, we have a problem and we know what the base run should look like at the reference mode. And then we know what the dynamics should look like if we haven't necessarily solved it, but we've made things better. A lot of times you see there's trade-offs, more of this means less of that. So, it can get, it's not obvious a lot of times what's the best course of action. And then we're always trying to bear in mind, I'll leave it with this, is whatever we're turning on and say, ooh, look, it works. Could somebody in the real world actually pull it off? Because if that can't happen, it's just academic gibberish, right? It's got to be something that a real policymaker could pull off. Because they're going to say, I don't do this modeling stuff. Just tell me what to do, right? And you got to give them pretty explicit instructions. So those are the types of things that we try and tell our students, like when you're building one of these things, what's the problem? What do the dynamics look like if you made things better, maybe not solve, but made it better? And could a real world person pull it off?
Interesting.
I'm actually going to share my screen again here. Is it turning up there or not quite yet? Let's see. I want to finish on a note since Mark has finished with the pandemic model. This is a model I did of the pandemic in Minsky. And what I wanted to show off with the particular model is that this is where the double entry bookkeeping side of Minsky can actually be used for more than just money. Because if you're there's exclusive categories. If you're susceptible but haven't caught the disease, this is where you are. If you're exposed, then you go from susceptible to exposed. If you're infected, you go from being exposed to infected. If you die, you're going from being fired to dead. So all the way through the assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero rule in Minsky happens to work very well for exclusive concepts like the pandemic. Now, this is going to be a little hello to our backdoor man here, God behind the data controller, because Dan will remember this. This is on the original show, COVID and was it COVID? What did you call it, Dan? COVID and something correlation.
Climate
correlations.
Welcome to
okay.
COVID and climate correlations. I'm your host,
so the voice,
Dan Sanderson.
So the voice of God there actually turned up in the chat column here on the right-hand side and said, I've built a model of the pandemic in Minsky. Would you like to see it? Now, and I said, yeah, sure. Okay, send it to me. And, there's some enthusiasm, but I'm glad to see somebody trying it. But I didn't have great expectations. I opened up this model, and my instant reaction was, holy. Let's just zoom in here.
No.
It's not this model. It's another one. I know, but
no. That was not your reaction, Steve. We're partially.
Fuck a duck. You're right. I said fuck a duck.
There we go.
I said fuck a duck. You're right. It was fuck a duck. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Let's just actually zoom in and see if I can show this godly table here. I'm trying to bring it up. It's rather a monster, as you can see. But rather than just a few little categories, it's going to take a while before it loads in the software properly. Okay. These are susceptible, recovered susceptible, vaccinated susceptible, exposed, recovered exposed, vaccinated exposed, infected, recovered, and blah, 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 with each of the transitions shown as an entry in a godly table. This is incredibly sophisticated, beyond what you can do with, I think, any other software package, period, because with the usual software engineering flowchart style of operation, there'd be wires going everywhere. Nobody could actually read it. But you can look at that table and say, okay, it's in the right place. That's in the correct place. Then how you define the logic, that's down here on the screen here as to how the causal factors are determined. You can actually understand what's going on. And one of the most important things for system dynamics is not just to be able to build a model which explains the dynamics of an important process, it's also to be able to explain it to somebody else. Because what we want to do, and this is something, a common objective for all of us here, is we want people who are making decisions to understand all the feedbacks, all the causal consequences. And with the black box approach they get out of neoclassical economics, which is wrong anyway, they're never going to understand it. At least with system dynamics, there's some chance to explain to people the complexity of the real world, or to manifest it in front of them and say, try your idea here before you inflict it on the public.
That was very well said. I'm gonna give everybody the warning that we're gonna say goodbye very shortly. And I want to thank everybody for participating in the chat. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to Twitter, LinkedIn, and for all the support you guys give us. We're going to see you all next week. And until then, be safe and enjoy your life.